Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Alex Brubaker. I'm the manager here at the Scholar. And as always, I am live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania at the bookstore. Whether you're joining us on Crowdcast or Facebook Live or even YouTube Live, thanks so much for tuning in. Welcome to our live stream series where we host authors and speakers, and we keep the conversation going about books we love. Tonight, our featured books are Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism by Drew Hart, and Rediscipling the White Church from Cheap Diversity to True Solidarity by David Swanson. If you haven't yet purchased their books, I'd like to encourage you to do so. Purchasing Drew and David's books through us helps support the authors, this event series, and the future of the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. They're both available in paperback, so more affordable, cheaper price points. So click the green button below on Crowdcast to make your purchase. It's the green button right below my face here. And if you're on Facebook Live or YouTube Live, simply head to our website at MidtownScholar.com to grab your copies. But at this time, I'd like to introduce you to our authors. David Swanson. Oh, shoot. Hello? Can you guys see me?
I can hear you. Yep.
All right. Something went wrong. All right, I'll just continue. Sorry about that. All right, our introduction to our authors this evening. Sorry about that, guys. David Swanson is the founding pastor of New Community Covenant Church, a multiracial congregation on the south side of Chicago. He also serves as the CEO of New Community Outreach, a nonprofit organization working to reduce causes of trauma and raise opportunities for equity in Chicago. He previously served as a director of church planning for the Evangelical Covenant Church. Drew Hart is a public theologian and professor of theology at Messiah College. He has 10 years of pastoral ministry experience and is the recipient of multiple awards for peacemaking. Hart attained his Master's of Divinity with an urban concentration from Missio Seminary and his PhD in theology and ethics from Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia. His first book, Trouble I've Seen, utilizes personal and everyday stories, theological ethics, and anti-racism frameworks to transform the church's understanding and witness. Hart lives in Harrisburg. Last thing before I hand it off to Drew and David, please click the Ask a Question button below if you have a question for either author. I can't promise we'll get to all of them, but we'll have some time after the conversation to go over your questions. So at this time, please join me in welcoming onto the screen Drew and David.
Well, thanks, Alex, for that introduction, and it's really a pleasure and a privilege to get to be here this evening. Here, I'm here in Chicago,
right.
But this is what we do now. This is our lives these days. Drew and I have known each other for a little while. We spent a long weekend on a bus a couple years ago, traveling throughout some civil rights monuments in the American South. And I've appreciated you from a distance, Drew, and your work has been significant for me. I just want to jump right into it so we can maximize our time. And the first question I have for you is not so much about the book, but really about our current moment. You're someone who thinks about Christian theology and race a lot, among some other things. And I'm just wondering, what are you noticing about this moment right now? What's standing out to you? Where is your attention right now?
Yeah. If I'm going to think about this moment and what's going on and kind of what I'm paying attention to, I guess the first thing is just the mass interest around race and racism that I've never seen so much interest. I mean, I know, and I'm sure you've experienced this. I think everybody I know that has written on race and racism, their books have been sold out at some point in the last couple of weeks. I've got friends, Austin Channing Brown, who was on the New York Times bestseller list, right? And almost all the top readings were on race. And so clearly, there's at least an awareness and an awakening around race and racism, especially among white Americans, that we haven't seen at this level before. At the same time, I mean, obviously, I'm also aware that much of the awareness that's happening is certainly online. Some of the conversations, even I'm seeing on YouTube, everybody's having a conversation on race in the church, and some of them are really superficial, right? And so I'm aware that people want to dive into these conversations, but that not everyone necessarily has done the reading, has studied and understands our history, is aware of the bigger structural systemic issues that are part of our society. So I'm kind of paying attention right now to the degree to which people are going to either dig deeper or kind of like, let this be a little shallow kiddie pool moment to then kind of get out the pool. Yeah.
What would indicate that it's the former and not the latter? What for you would be some metrics where you would think, okay, this is genuinely different?
Yeah, I mean, I think number one, just even in terms of the rhetoric, right? I mean, I think that right now people are still talking about race and racism in terms of just issues around personal prejudice. And so if they were to begin to identify systems of injustice, right? Looking at, and let's not leaving it out of the abstract into concrete things like the distribution of funds for public education, right? Or who has access to resources and opportunities, healthcare, housing, right? All these very tangible things. When we begin to pay attention to those tangible things, then I think it's a sign that people are digging deeper and are actually looking for, and I'll say radical in a meaningful way, radical as in getting to the root of things, right? Mm-hmm. That they're trying to get to the root of the problems rather than just the consequences of that, or the outcomes that we see that are maybe a little bit easier to notice. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. You hinted at something that I actually want to get at, which is sort of how you think about racism. I do think it's one of the helpful things about your book is that it is personal. You write from your own perspective and tell some of your own story in it, but all throughout you're kind of breaking down some of these terms, some of these ideas. And so you talked a little bit there about the difference between personal and systemic racism. Could you unpack that a little bit for us if folks are new to that idea? What is the difference between the two?
Yeah, I often say that, if you listen very carefully when people are having conversations around racism, we're using the same word and sometimes using them in very different ways. And so I often say that we have thin and thick definitions of racism that are both operating simultaneously. And you've got to pay attention to what people actually mean when they use these words, right? Yeah. And so the thin definition, I'd say, is actually the more popular definition. And oftentimes it's the first definition you'll find in the dictionary, right? It's about personal prejudice and hatred from one person to another because of the color of their skin or something like that, right? And I think that's the predominant way that most people think about racism in our society today, judging someone based on their skin color, having prejudice in that kind of sense. But if you were to leave that and enter into a sociology department or critical race theory, and you're reading scholars that have been studying race and racism, they're not giving you that thin definition. They're looking at a sociological way of understanding it. So they're looking at how race actually organizes our society, right? And so that we pay attention to the institutions and the policies, segregation, right? The ways that our society shapes sense of identity and the myths, right? The stories that we tell ourselves that we live by to justify unjust systems, like we talked about before, education funding and healthcare and, just the various resources and opportunities that people have available to them throughout their lives. And so I think that we need to move to that thicker definition where we see it. That's why people sometimes use the word systemic racism or institutional racism. I think Kendi talked about policy, trying to get people thinking in that direction. There's different ways that people get at it. But it's very important that we move from just thinking about what's in the heart, because at the end of the day, we waste a lot of time arguing about what's in somebody's heart or whether it was, first of all humans have some prejudice, right? I mean, we take shortcuts in our minds, right? Yeah. But of course, you don't have to be stuck there, but it almost misses the point when we don't deal with the bigger, broader issues as well. Because the only reason why we're so socialized in terms of the prejudice is because we're being socialized by a society that literally has centuries, right, of white supremacy and anti-Black racism that have shaped how we justify the world as it is, rather than questioning and struggling to change it.
You write about the way that white people scapegoat the bad racists, right? One of the examples I think about is you remember Donald Sterling was the owner of the Clippers, right? I mean, everybody knew for a long time, just how horrible this guy was, right? They knew how he treated his players, how he talked about his players. Everybody in the league knew, but it took this really dramatic, right? Literally caught on tape. So you could actually know his motives, right? You could actually say we know his motives.
That's the only way. Otherwise,
Right.
Otherwise, people are not okay with calling him a racist, right? Because I mean, you literally have to like burn a cross in a yard, or put on a KKK hoodie, or call someone the N-word for mainstream America to be okay with recognizing racism in our society. That's such a problematic way of analyzing, especially again, if you're looking at how we organize society and the ways that injustice and oppression are structured into our everyday lives. That distracts us, right? When we're only looking for this 1950s version of racism and not seeing the sophisticated ways that racism lives on in our 21st century today. So yeah, I give the example, which is similar, right? I talk in the book about Paula Deen, right?
Yeah.
That Paula Deen, when she said her stuff, like, everyone was quick to like, bad Paula Deen, everyone's shaming Paula Deen, and for a moment I was there. I was like, yeah, bad Paula Deen, because she wanted some like plantation wedding and used the N-word and all kinds of crazy stuff. But then I thought, I was like, wait a minute, like this doesn't make any sense. Like Paula Deen didn't, invent racism. She's not like a mad scientist who was like in the lab and created it and like spread it into our water, right? She's not like
her recipes,
right? Through her recipes, right? The interesting thing about Paula Deen is not that she's the cause that we can all somehow scapegoat and point the finger at, because that's what was happening. Everybody was, and when everybody is saying, oh, she's such a bad racist, then something's wrong. Because if you want to understand Paula Deen and her racism, all you have to do is read a history book, right? You read an American history book, and then you begin to understand, oh, I know where she got these ideas from. She got it from American society, right? And so all of a sudden, then you realize Paula Deen was socialized by communities, by her family and friends and neighbors, right? That's where these ideas came from. And so all of a sudden, everybody can't be scapegoating Paula Deen, because Paula Deen, she didn't do this on her own. And so America needs to recognize its own complicity in creating hundreds and hundreds of Paula Deens, right? And that kind of racism. And again, without only focusing on the overt stuff that gets us going, we've got to pay attention then to the more problematic stuff, the stuff that's actually killing people every day and destroying people's lives.
Mm-hmm. You write, I'm going to quote you here. You say, to break the cycle of ignorance to racism and faulty intuition, members of dominant groups, and you're here thinking, I think, of white people, must learn to not trust their own gut, as they have been socialized outside of the life experiences of marginalized groups. So you've kind of talked a little bit about this idea of socialization already, but can you talk a little bit about that learning to not trust your own guts? Like why should white people not trust our own guts when it comes to these kinds of conversations?
Yeah, so when I wrote that, and in number one, that specific phrase, I wanted to apply to any dominant groups around the world, right? In some ways. I mean, I talk about white people specifically also in that chapter, but I'm making a broader argument around our ways of knowing, right? So the fancy word, if somebody wants to impress people, is epistemology, right? It's thinking about our ways of knowing. And so I wanted to think theologically about our ways of knowing, because I was getting frustrated having conversations with folks, and no matter what Black people said, like over and over again, I was seeing white people dismissing Black people's lived experiences, their testimonies of what was going on. And so I was like, there's got to be, this is too frustrating, right? And so I wanted to, it was out of frustration that I wrote that particular chapter. And my whole thing was like, look, if you walk all the way through history, white people were always getting it wrong. At least like today, most white people will agree, like from like 1619 up to 1865, right? So that's during slavery, right? Most white people will say, yeah, white people got it wrong, right? And that the Black people who were saying that they were wrong were right. Same thing all the way up from 1865 to 1965, if you want to, take Selma's ending point, I don't know, for the, civil rights moment, that during that time, another 100 years, most people would say white people, the majority of white people were getting it wrong and the majority of Black people were getting it right. And so what can we learn from this when we look back at history and begin to see that white people were getting it so wrong? Well, as someone who doesn't believe that race itself, in terms of like, one skin color or being labeled white isn't the reason why, right? Mm-hmm. Like we're all human beings at the end of the day. And so there's something else going on. And it is how they're being socialized in such a way that they're dismissing and denying the experience of the people who actually are going through the lived experience itself. And so for me, my whole thing was this idea that some theologians and others have argued is the kind of epistemological advantage of the oppressed, right? It's the idea that there's a particular vantage point that we all have in terms of what we see. Like, think about it. I joke with students sometimes. I say, you think about high school, maybe especially if you had an older high school and you looked under the desk, right? And probably gum and nasty stuff, right? But if you looked at the top, you might not see all the crud that's there, right? Your angle on it, even if you're looking at the same item, is going to shape what you see and your perception of it. And so my argument is, it's not because people are of European descent that they don't understand, but they're actually being socialized out. Their ways of knowing are being socialized outside of the lived experience of the people who are encountering the oppression, right? And so in that sense, then what seems to be the only option, and I think the most theological option, if you think about the life of Jesus, the one who came in solidarity with the least, last, and lost of society, right? The oppressed and the poor in his own society. It seems like the only real option is for white people in particular, and in this case, white Christians, to I call it engage in counterintuitive solidarity. Right. That's why I call the chapter "Don't Go with Your Gut." Right. That your own socialized response to these moments are going to turn you the wrong direction. And it's not until you have a renewed mind and a renewed intuitions around these things, because you've immersed yourself in the perspectives and the vantage points of the communities that are most oppressed, that you then can begin to maybe once again begin to trust your gut a little bit more. Right. And so there's this need to actually enter into solidarity, live in that, and then see again anew in a wholly different way than you had before. And so that's kind of, that's the sum of it, right? That we actually have to wrestle with our ways of knowing, which I don't necessarily think a lot of, I'd say, folks who engage on race and racism in the broader sense are not thinking about it from that theological sense of what are the new practices that will actually help us think through this in a more holistic way. Yeah.
Why do you think then that white Christians have generally not seen that, or have seen that and refuse to pursue it? So you're describing a possibility, right? You are describing something that could be, that is available to us.
Available. Always has been available, right? That's the thing. Always has been available, right?
And those of us who are Christians would in fact say that, theologically, that possibility actually represents God's intention for those who confess the name of Jesus. So what is it? Is there something inherent to white Christianity that keeps us from availing ourselves of that possibility?
Yeah, well, if we're going to go all the way in, on this, I'd say the biggest problem, I would say, is the domestication and the diluting of Jesus himself, right? And so Jesus, here's the interesting thing. You read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's pretty clear. It's pretty straightforward. Jesus's relationship to the oppressed. It's not ambiguous. It's not unclear. You read some of them, Luke, man, you just get beat over the head with it constantly, right? It's just in your face.
Right from the beginning.
There's nothing ambiguous about it. And so what happened, I think, for many white Christians is that they adopted a Jesus, right, and a Christianity that was severed from the radicalness of Jesus, from the commitments of Jesus. And so the life and teachings of Jesus, it's almost like a buffet line for many white Christians, right? You pick and choose what you want to emphasize and you leave the rest behind. And so you have this sense, I love Jesus, my personal Lord and Savior, but they seem to not know Jesus in terms of his commitments that he clearly he's the one who says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor, release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Jesus is not ambiguous. That's what he goes out and does then, right? And so I think that would be my starting point. But I think that overall then, out of that, then you can see domesticating and over spiritualizing and severing the spiritual from the social instead of a holistic understanding of the good news of Jesus. It's depoliticizing its meanings. I mean, you can't read, it's extremely political language, right? Kingdom of God, even gospel was a political term from the first century, right? A evangelion, right? And so Lord, all these terms were extremely political. Even the terms that for Jesus, Savior, right? These are terms that are you normally described for Caesar, and they're saying they're applying it to Jesus. And so I think that there's ways in which by spiritualizing, domesticating, diluting the message, it creates the space then for it to be malleable, to become whatever you want it to be. And so literally, eventually, I mean, I would argue that Jesus gets refashioned, colonized, maybe is a better way of saying it. Jesus gets so colonized that he becomes a mascot for domination, right? I mean, that's what the image of, there's no accident that the super whitening of Jesus happens in US in the 20th century and then goes global, right? The famous head of Christ image from the early 20th century that's tied to Jim Crow white supremacy and is trying to image Jesus in a particular way that identifies him with the oppressed. And so it's not just a historical problem, it's actually a theological problem by identifying Jesus with the powerful rather than the least of these, the crucified of the world rather than the crucified, right? The crucifiers, right?
It's deep, man. This entanglement is so old and so intertwined with identity. So oftentimes white Christians, we talk about racial reconciliation. You talk about solidarity in your book, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about that. Like why solidarity? Why that language of solidarity? And you mentioned it a little bit already. This counterintuitive solidarity that is possible. But what does solidarity look like, and why that vision for something alternative to the racialized society of this country?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that came out of personal experience, right? Of being right out of college at a multiracial congregation, but it didn't seem like there was commitment. Like it seemed like many people wanted to get people in the room together. Let's get Black and white people in the room together. But they didn't care about our lived experiences outside of the four walls of the church. They didn't care about the education and the housing and the jobs and the livable wages, right? That many Black people were experiencing every day. And so for me, I'm not interested in just sitting down and getting to know people and that be the extent of our relationship. Link arms with me. Let's share life together and let's struggle and join in, be so committed that my problems are your problems. I always tell people, like, people talk about, oh, you down for reconciliation? You want reconciliation to happen? Come join me out in the streets when we're struggling or organizing or doing whatever we're doing. And we can get to know each other. And if you want relationship, that's your opportunity, but you're going to have to meet me in that space, right? Because that's the work that I want to be committed to. While I think that sometimes white people, I think, prefer just the relationships and then leaving everything the stain, because they've been hoodwinked and been told that it's just about relationships and proximity. And if you solve that, then racism will go away. And I always counter and say, tell that to my ancestors who were enslaved, and there were Black folk cooking and cleaning inside the master's house, Black women being raped, right? All kinds of stuff. There was all kinds of proximity, right? And so proximity and relationship in terms of being close to one another alone doesn't necessarily challenge the racial hierarchy that's embedded in our system. And so we've got to keep focused on that and not just on relationships. Relationships, I'm not downplaying that relationships are still important, but they can be over prioritized and to the degree that we downplay justice and liberation for people and communities that have been struggling for centuries in this land.
Yeah, I've thought about the way that white Christians think about relationships when it comes to this. And I think there's two, I'm curious if you think this is right or not. I think there's two ways that we think about this. One is we think of relationships as evidence that reconciliation has happened, right? So that like, okay, like there's we got a Black worship leader, or I look around the sanctuary of my church and I can point out, a handful of people of color, or I do have a friend, right? I have a Black friend. So it's evidence of something, or the other is that it's a means to an end.
Right.
That we need to pursue these relationships in order to rectify something that's wrong. We think about injustice as a kind of fracture of relationship, and so if we can put a relationship back together, then we accomplish something. Right. And neither of these, like you say, actually does anything to disturb the racist status quo.
That's right.
Neither of these do anything to upend white supremacy. You can be in a relationship with somebody and leave the material sources of that person's suffering completely alone. Right. And I think that is, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that is generally what white Christians and white churches have done when it comes to reconciliation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's why, I mean, you talk to some Black and womanist theologians, racial reconciliation is the baddest word you can throw out there, right? Precisely because because we've seen how this word has been deployed, right? We've heard this language and it doesn't mean freedom or justice, right? It just means white people get a Black friend, which they've been wanting, but we don't get freedom and justice and flourishing neighborhoods, right? And so it's deeply problematic. And so that's what there's been ongoing debates and conversations in Black theological spaces around what's the relationship between liberation and reconciliation. And I think the overall consensus, there's some debate, but the overall consensus is liberation precedes reconciliation, right? That there has to be freedom and justice present for actual reconciliation to happen. Otherwise, then it's the slave and the slave master. That's not reconciliation, right? That's a hierarchical relationship and an unjust relationship that we're talking about. We've got to actually level the playing field if we're going to actually talk about meaningful reconciliation. And so that's, for me, like I'm a theologian of shalom, right? This vision, this ultimate vision of God's shalom for creation. But if we're going to get there, well, number one, shalom itself is holistic. It encounters and embodies everything, right? And so for shalom to be present, justice has to be present, right?
That's right.
It's not our puny sense of peace like we talk about. It's this much bigger, beautiful thing. And we're interconnected. It's not this individualistic thing in terms of how people think about it. And so the biblical vision for shalom ought to be operative, but it reminds us that to avoid the cheap reconciliation and to do the more costly work of following Jesus and struggling in solidarity again with our oppressed neighbors and friends. And so I think that's the work, at least for Christians, that should be the obvious call for us to join in with that work.
Yeah. I think a lot of what has passed for reconciliation has been white people saying, yeah, we'll let you, join us. We'll let you come into our church. We'll let you join the thing that we're already doing. Whereas the vision that I think you're articulating with solidarity is that, there's already really good work happening. There's already really good justice work happening, right? There's already communities of faith who've been about this for generations. There's already a memory of what this looks like. You want to come out and join us? Do you want to come and support that? This is a very, very different.
It's a very different paradigm, right? Because that then breaks the paradigm of the savior complex, right? The white savior complex, people swooping in, they do their drive-by stuff and they disappear, rather than what it would look like to join in, to follow, right? Where those who normally see themselves as always leading actually learn how to follow the leadership and submit to the leadership that already exists in the community, and learn and to see in partnership and join in with the work there. And so I think that there's an opportunity for folks, and that there's actually growth, right? So on the Christian side, there's some growth that can happen for those who are first to learn how to be last. And for those who are last, to learn how to be first.
It sounds very biblical.
I don't know who said that. They say Jesus. I don't know.
I don't know. I'm going to ask you just a couple more questions, and then we're going to turn it back over to Alex to do some Q&A. So I think if folks have questions, you all can start sending them in. This can be a little, maybe a tangent, but I think it's important. One of the things that I hear well-meaning white people say, people who would kind of think of themselves as kind of racially, awake or enlightened, is that they're hopeful as the younger generation grows up, that the younger generation is going to kind of get it more, or they're hopeful in the changing demographics of the country as the country itself becomes more diverse. I I don't get the sense that you're quite as optimistic about this sort of natural bend. And one of the things you say is whiteness is not a static category. Whiteness subtly shifts and changes over time as necessary. I totally agree with you, but I'm often surprised at how few people seem to grasp this fact. So can you unpack that idea a little bit for folks?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's people are not doing the homework, right? I mean, it's actually in your face in terms of just the adaptability of whiteness, a way in which it can just mutate over and over and over again. And so you look back to the 17th century as the idea of whiteness is emerging, and many people who are considered white would not be considered white today, right? And so you have, Irish and Italian and even Germans, right? They're not properly, because you got to be Anglo-Saxon Protestant to be white in that sense. And so it morphs, but over time it expanded and made room for other folks to participate in that. And so, yeah, you have to be very attuned to the way that whiteness works in our society today. And I'm always interested because, I mean, as somebody who teaches young people, right, at the college level, there's no way I could just be super optimistic, because I see students having been racialized, discipled by race, clearly, right? And by that, I don't mean, like, most of them wouldn't say that in terms of their language. They wouldn't say, oh, I've been discipled by race, because most of the white students don't use a lot of racial language to describe themselves, but they're oblivious of other experiences. They have narratives and identities that help them create their own sense of who they belong with, right? And who they don't belong with. And so race is happening all around them. And through like a lot of my classes, we deal with race and theology and kind of unpack this stuff. And so by the end, they're always saying like, wow, like, I mean, it's like a 360 for them. And so I see the shifts of what happens when they actually learn the history and think about how their faith actually calls them to something beyond just the emptiness of whiteness, right? White racial identity and practice, social performance. And so, yeah, it just didn't even make sense for me to be just overly optimistic, because I see that communities are not doing their work in terms of how they're raising young people up today, right? It may not be as ugly as some of the stuff that we're seeing in the 50s, but it's mutated in such a way that it's sophisticated enough to keep the racial system going in our presence, even if it's not as mean and as hostile, right? And same thing in terms of demographics, right? People talk about changing demographics, but I mean, all you have to do is look over at South Africa, right? Mm-hmm. And you see a country where the majority of people are Black, and there's still clear white supremacy happening in that space, and power and all that stuff. And so those things are not going to just go away. It's going to take intentionality, and we're going to have to put our best minds together to scheme and plot for good, right? And just as much as the scheming and plotting happened for white supremacy.
Yeah, and I would say too that this is where our churches, if we were aware of what we're talking about tonight, right? If we saw race, if we saw racism as a discipleship issue, as an issue of related to following Jesus, this is where the church could actually make a difference, I think, right? Because for as much as our culture likes to think of itself in this sort of multicultural, racially awoke sort of way, the fact of the matter remains, we are a deeply segregated society.
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
By every possible metric, that hierarchy is deeply, deeply in place right now.
Right.
And so the opportunity for the church to say, we are going to, from the youngest age up, disciple our people in a different direction. We are going to be forming women and men who have a different outlook on the world and who stand and live in sacrificial solidarity, with sisters and brothers of color. That would be an amazing witness, it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the church has to come to a point where I would say discipleship has to be explicitly anti-racist, right? It just has to be explicitly anti-racist. There's no way in a society so deeply entrenched in white supremacy as these past 4 or 5 centuries, right? There's no faithful way to follow Jesus except for being explicitly anti-racist. And so we've got to do the work, which means we've got to do a lot, the theological, the biblical, the ways of being, re-socializing, right? how we tell our story, our own sense of identity of belonging, and how we understand our belonging. All of that we've got to do some serious work in the church.
Yeah. That's good. Okay, I want to ask you one last question, and then Alex will jump back on and kind of moderate some question and answer. This is a bookstore event, and so I wanted to ask you about some books, mostly because that's kind of, I'm just curious selfishly for myself. So a couple ways of asking this question. I'm curious what you're reading right now. I'm curious if there are authors that you find yourself returning to. Maybe especially authors who are not in fashion right now, or some of us have forgotten about. Who are those voices that you find yourself going back to?
Yeah, well, let me start with who I'm reading right now. I'm rereading a text, but it's a different version of a text. So Richard Hughes had a book called Myths America Lives By, and he got challenged by some Black scholars and realized that he missed the biggest myth of all, which was white supremacy, right? I mean, in some ways, like, race is there throughout the book, but he doesn't name white supremacy. So he does a whole new second edition. And it's beautiful. In terms of just history, right? It just helps you see all these myths and stuff. So that's just what I happen to be reading at this moment, is the second edition. Don't get the first one. You definitely, if you're going to read that, you want to have an understanding of just how we got to where we are, some of these things. That's an interesting text. But there's many texts. Anybody that knows me knows I'm deeply, deeply shaped by James Cone, and I probably have read Cone's God of the Oppressed in particular more than any of them, but I've read many of them. But that one, that probably is why I'm so interested in the epistemological questions, right? Because I think that particular text, he gets into that somewhat. I know Kelly Brown Douglas is another one that's really important. I don't know if I've read it like tons of times because it's not that old of a text, but her Stand Your Ground in particular. But I first was introduced to her, the Black Christ, her early work. Willie James Jennings, to me, is just, he's amazing. Now, I always tell people, and many of these books are a little bit heavy lifting. That one is very much so heavy lifting for a lot of folks. But Willie James Jennings' book, The Christian Imagination, is just brilliant. It's brilliant. And so when I'm really serious, I jump into that. I'd say the lighter, if you want to get into Jennings, and it's beautifully written, but it is also dense for folks. So it's a little bit easier entry into Jennings is his Acts commentary as well. But anyway, there's so many great resources out there. I could go on and on about them, listing just texts that have been influential for me. But those certainly are yours. And I'll just mention, just because before we switch off, obviously for folks that are listening, David Swanson's book, Rediscipling the White Church. It's deeply, you could hear the pastoral heart as you're trying to really care about, you know what I mean? Like, I get this is like, how do we actually move folks along and wrestle with this stuff in the church? And so anyway, I just want to throw that, that people are aware of that as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Drew. It's been great. It's been great.
Yeah.
Welcome back, Alex.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Drew. Thanks, David. This was awesome. Thank you so much. To our viewers out there, we're about to do audience Q&A. So if you have a question for Drew or David, click the Ask a Question button. It's below our faces there, below the green button there. So click that, submit your question, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. Also, a quick other plug. If you're on Crowdcast, the green button, that'll take you to our website to purchase both of our authors' books this evening. So feel free to click that now, or you can wait till the end. Do you guys want to start talking about Trump right away? Is that cool?
Sure. We're not afraid.
All right. So this question is from Matt. Matt writes, with all that has happened in the last 4 years, why do you think that 82% of white evangelicals are expected to still vote for Donald Trump? David, actually, if you want to start us off, and then we'll go to Drew.
Yeah, I just don't think anything has changed between this election and the last election. I think it was a lie when white Christians said that we're supporting this man in spite of what he says and what he promises to do. They were supporting him for what he was going to do, and they've been pleased, I think. So on a deeper level, I think that it indicates the ways in which a form of patriotism, white supremacy, white identity, get intertwined with people's Christian faith. And Drew said it a minute ago, our discipleship has to be explicitly anti-racist. It's just not. It's never been, not even implicitly anti-racist in the white Christian church. And so most of these folks who are, church-going Christian people are not in spaces that are challenging these assumptions at all. I don't know, Drew, what would you say?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's clear that Trump was about a power grab, right? And that deeply fits in. I think that people don't see any conflict with their willingness to grab for power. That is, I mean, what I've heard was that it was all about the Supreme Court justices. At least that's what that's the excuse that I've heard. And it's okay to get those, to have that power grab, despite the impact that it's going to have in terms of, aside of whatever, even if they agree and think that what Trump is working for is right, which I don't, but even if they did, right, that ignoring his law and order responses to Black Lives Matter from original, right? Ignoring the impact in terms of what he said around the border and its impact on Mexican Americans, ignoring the Muslim ban that he promised to have ahead of time. These are all things he promised, right? And at least partially tried to deliver on many of them in a variety of different ways. And so there's the power grab. Like I said before, I think that the Whiteness Jesus allows for that. It condones that. It's a mascot for this kind of work. And so social domination is not off the table for many white American evangelicals, right? It actually fits together like a glove with how they understand their faith and the reclaiming, right? I mean, you think Make America Great Again, the reclaiming, the nostalgia of all of that is so deeply there. And I believe that at the end of the day, the theology hasn't changed, right? It's not a theology that leads people into solidarity like we've been talking about. It's not a theology that has people seeking justice and for justice and liberation for oppressed and vulnerable people in our world. It's an otherworldly as it relates to that kind of stuff, except for when they want to get their issues like abortion and different things on the table. Yeah.
Drew, this next question is for you. Lydia wants to know, what, if any, changes have you seen regarding racial justice and racial reconciliation on the white Christian college campus? What steps do you still believe to be necessary?
Yeah. And I guess, I mean, I can only speak from my own Christian college. I know in some ways there's a lot of similarities between a lot of them, but each is different. And so I will just talk about my own experience. I'd say, as someone who was both formerly a student and now teaches at the same institution, I've seen some changes, right? I've seen slightly, it's slow, but I've seen increased growth around students of color in the space, and more programming than probably existed before for those students. I've seen an increase in faculty in some ways. And certainly we had Kelly Brown Douglas, speaking a couple years ago. So we've, some of the programming conversations around white supremacy are a part of the conversation. So there's some good things happening, but let's not be confused. Like, Messiah still centers white students in its decisions and tries to make sure, above all, that we don't scare off white evangelicals more than we're more concerned about how do we attract and make sure that these Black and brown students are thriving in this space. So even as we are growing, I mean, I know it's not popular to be putting on blast my own institution, but there's ways in which white supremacy, even if it's not explicit and even if there is growth happening, there's ways in which we've got to make some really hard decisions around what kind of institution we want to be. And so I think that that's the kind of stuff that I think across the board, right? What does it mean to be a Christian institution? What makes an institution Christian? That adjective gets thrown around all the way, but like, if you actually listen to the word Christ-like, is Jesus shaped, right? Like, so literally the things of Jesus have to be shaping the commitments to the margins, and the oppression that people are experiencing within your institution ought to be significant. And also it's attentiveness to the issues around our society. Again, our our school does care about these things, but it's two-sided sometimes. It struggles because it doesn't always want to take the full courageous risks that I think we really need to if we're going to fully embody, I think, what God desires for us.
This next question is both for David and Drew. It's from Susan. They ask, have you seen a difference in the church's response to the most recent racial injustices when compared to the past? David, if you want to start us off again.
I mean, that's the question right now that I think a lot of people are grappling with. The short answer is yes. I was talking to somebody about this recently, and oh, no, I wasn't talking. I wish. I was listening to a podcast that had Ta-Nehisi Coates on it. Wouldn't that be fun? And, Coates is famously pessimistic about these things. And he said, I actually feel a little bit of hope. And he said hope, and I almost, fell down. But he said, for the first time in my life, I am seeing non-Black people vocally and physically participate in protesting racism and white supremacy. So I think I'm a pessimist when it comes to this stuff, but I want to acknowledge that's a true thing that's happening right now. Is it going to be sustained? I have no idea. So what I've been saying as a Christian is that our commitments to this have to transcend this moment and people's response to this moment. Our hope has to be rooted in something beyond how white people respond to this moment. Our commitment to solidarity has to be rooted deeper than that. So it does feel different right now, but I would be super hesitant to make any prediction about what it's going to look like next week.
Yeah, I think for the most part, I would agree with David that there's no question. It's fact, I think, by this point that more white people have responded than at any other historical moment. So that's undeniable, right? I do see it as often as a lot of it is shallow, but I think the intentions are there, but they just don't understand the issues of what's actually going on in our society at the full level. But I think the one thing that actually maybe does provide more hope for me. So in fact, this is a little short plug for my new book coming out in September. In studying about social change, there's an interesting number that may surprise people. They say that, and this is globally, that movements that have sustained and active participation, that they only need 5% of the population engaged in sustained and active movement, right? And so that makes you wonder, maybe we've got a critical mass of folks who are willing, hopefully, right, to get their hands dirty and go the extra level. But it's got to be sustained and active, not just people who feel it and maybe just want to post online, but are willing to get involved on some level. But that, according to the research, no movement that hits that 5% fails if they sustain and remain active. And so, again, I don't think the majority of folks are going to be in a part of that significant work, but I do think maybe we're getting closer to something like that on the ground where we can get some folks willing to live in solidarity and struggle together for justice.
We have time for just a couple more questions here. Let's go to this next one. Drew, this one's from Christopher. They ask, they've seen concern from white evangelicals recently that critical race theory is a non-biblical worldview that is infiltrating the church. What is your response to this view?
Yeah, I'm so grateful that I don't swim in some circles, but I have seen some friends dealing with this. So actually, I've never actually been asked this directly. So I'm glad, I guess, to even process it myself. But I've seen some friends, I think maybe in more reform circles and stuff, dealing with people saying, "Oh, you're engaging in critical race theory." Number one, it's clear that people don't even know what they're talking about when they're saying, critical race. It doesn't even make any sense. All we're talking about, critical race theory is just a discipline of studying race critically. That means through scholarship, careful readings, careful studying of the history, careful exploring how it shapes our society today. And there is no singular critical race theory. There's conversations happening. Even right now, like there's been some interesting articles, some people critiquing Kendi around some of the ways that he's framing the conversation. Some people critiquing Robin DiAngelo around some of how she frames things, right? But guess there's a whole conversation of diversity and scholarship that's in conversation together. All it is people who are committed. If you're against racism and want to be disciplined in thinking through that, then that's what critical race theory is. It's a scholarly way of being disciplined in thinking about anti-racism, about how do we dismantle this thing, right? How do we understand it? How do we dismantle it? And so it really doesn't make any sense. Most of the people who are saying these things, it's like somebody apparently used this phrase and somehow it's become a bad word, but people don't understand it. So all I would say is read some critical race theory for yourself, and you'll see how silly the conversation is around why people have such negative connotations to the term critical race theory.
And if I would just add that it becomes a scapegoat. I think there's always going to be something that white people can point to not engage this conversation. What was it before critical race theory? Maybe liberalism. At some point it was communism, right? Socialism. Like you're gonna get associated with something that's the boogeyman to keep you from having to thoughtfully actually talk about this stuff. Right. So I just think we should be honest about that. When somebody throws that at us, kind of point out this is a tendency of whiteness, is to always deflect to something else so that we don't actually have to have this conversation.
Yeah, and let me just along with that point then, so use your mind when you read. You don't have to agree with everything of anything. Anytime I agree with everything in a book, I'm worried and I feel like I've got to reread it because I probably wasn't reading carefully enough, right? And so we ought to engage critically and thoughtfully, give close readings to things, and engage the conversation. As a Christian, you can do that work. Yeah.
So I'm gonna wrap up our last question here. I've had like 5 questions of kind of the same variation here that I'm gonna mix into one question here, and that is, how can people go from knowledge to action? So another form of the question was, what are good first steps you wish folks would take to move from words to actions that go beyond shallow and short term? So you get the idea of the questions. We're coming here into this live stream and we're having a conversation, which is a great start. But where do we go from here? And what advice would you give for someone? There's another question here that someone wanted to know, where do I recommend a place for me to join this movement? So David, if you want to start, and then Drew, if you want to wrap us up on this question of knowledge to action.
Yeah. This is going to sound a little hokey, but I actually would recommend Drew's book. It's a really good starting point. I think it's accessible, and you're gonna walk away with some knowledge that you didn't have before. So one of the ways that to use Drew's language, that whiteness socializes us is to prioritize our own comfort and safety above everything else, and that's a significant thing that needs to change. I'm talking specifically about white people now, to move toward action. That we have to prioritize the flourishing of Black and brown people in particular over our own comfort. We have to prioritize, let's be honest, the survival of Black and brown people over our own comfort. And the fact of the matter is that white people prioritize our comfort over our fellow citizens' survival right now. So that's kind of an ugly thing to say, but I think it bears out. And so that's a commitment that I think anybody needs to make if they're early on in this process and they're kind of stepping into this. You've got to realize that you're going to step into significant discomfort, and that's actually good. That's good for you. That's good for the people who you're going to be working alongside and in relationship with. But reframing this priority of comfort, safety, stability, security as something that's actually done a lot of damage in our society, I think is going to be really, really important. And then I think we got to, again, for those of us who are white, we've got to submit ourselves to people of color. We have to be in networks, in organizations, in relationships, in churches, or in denominations where there's opportunity for us to literally kind of submit our agendas to other people. We should not trust ourselves on this. Like we are novices in every sense of the word when it comes to the work of racial justice and solidarity. And so we need to be able to be in situations where we can say, hey, we're in, we want to participate in this. We don't really know what we're doing. So direct us, share with us where we should be and what we should be prioritizing right now. If a person can do those things, I actually get pretty hopeful about that white person's kind of trajectory toward the solidarity that Drew articulates.
Yeah. Let me think. Number one, I will say this. This can go in two ways, just on the knowledge part before I get to the action part. I've seen two different responses from white folks. I know some white folks who will do book studies all day and will never actually do anything, right? So they just love to read and stuff like that. But it never translate into a new way of living in the world, right? And so I think being aware of that temptation to just stay comfortable through reading, right, is something. On the other hand, though, I know folks who, that education in books and stuff, that's nothing. And so they just go out and they just want to start doing things, right? And sometimes they're more harmful than helpful often. And so I think the idea that that actually learning and unlearning is actual work, right? So I don't want to dismiss that's not actual work. People's minds have been deeply shaped and socialized by the narratives of race, and we've got to take that seriously. Anyway, from there, then thinking about action. I mean, there's just so many ways. When I always encourage folks, figure out who's doing the work already in the community, right? So if you live, many of us who are on right now live in Harrisburg, do an assessment of who's doing the work already, and then join in with that. I mean, I think that those are some of the easiest opportunities, right? In terms of who's organizing, right? Who's building coalitions, who's actually doing stuff in the neighborhood, and how can I join in, especially when there's opportunities, as David said, right, to come under the leadership of Black and brown people. These are great opportunities to start, where, especially if you're not trying to take over, but trying to actually follow, that these are really great opportunities. I'm a big believer, every white person needs a Black mentor, right, in their life, right? Somebody to come under them and to hold them accountable in their life. If you have that, you're a blessed person. And I think that to take that seriously. But yeah, I think, and it's in the context of learning and living, right? Living it out, embodying what you're learning about, and then you going back and forth between the two, that there's something really meaningful about that. And so it can get dangerous when you're just choosing one side or the other. And I would just say, again, I mean, since we're giving this in the context of the church, I think that literally is what Christian discipleship is all about. Yeah. Somehow people have thought of the word discipleship and they think first about study groups or small groups or all these different things, cells and things. Discipleship is about following Jesus, right, into the world, right? That's literally what it's about. And so how do you practice that? How do you embody that? If you are claiming to follow Jesus, but it doesn't take you in solidarity with those who are oppressed and vulnerable in your communities, then you're not actually following Jesus.
Yeah, that's right.
David, Drew, thank you guys so much for joining us here for this very necessary conversation. Thank you to our viewers for tuning in. Congrats on both your books. To our viewers out there, click the green button below if you want to purchase both their books. Head to our website, MidtownScholar.com. I'm also going to be outside the bookstore this Saturday if you don't feel like doing the online stuff. I'm going to have both their books this Saturday. We have a Saturday sidewalk sale, so I'll meet you out there. You guys can pick up your copy then. I want to give you guys the last word. So David, then Drew, just let's close it up. What's your last word to our audience here?
What came to mind as Drew was talking is the importance of being connected locally. I think in a social media age, it's really easy to get overwhelmed. We're connected in so many different directions. So there's something really beautiful and life-giving about finding local expressions of this work of racial solidarity. Ideally, as Christians, there's some congregational element to that, but it doesn't have to just be limited to the life of the church. And so I think if you're somebody who's looking for this, don't get too overwhelmed by everything that's happening right now. Look close, look to neighbors, look to the good stuff that's happening within, 5-10 miles of where you live. I promise there's something there. And then then the possibility for it getting really intertwined with your life is much more likely, and it gets really good.
Yeah, I would add, I think we've all got to do the work. You know, I often tell so I go speaking at like white congregations. Sometimes they'll be like, what do we do? We're all white congregation and all white neighborhood, you know? And so somehow they see themselves as exempt from racial problems. And I tell them, no, that means you're in the center of the action, right? You're at the heart of it. And so for me, they need to do some work. In fact, at Messiah, we talk about this a lot. This is one of the things that I say when I'm in congregations. We talk about race and place. So I tell congregations, like, figure out, like, tell the story of the land that you live on, right? Who are the indigenous folks who lived there first on the land, and start telling the story up to the present, like what policies and practices were instituted, redlining, restricted deeds, right? Sundown towns, and the different hostilities and things that happened to create, because this didn't happen accidentally, right? How were these communities organized in a particular way like that? And so I think that there's some work that congregations can do that is local as well. Tell your own story. And then white people need to learn their own story individually, right? Their families. How did they become white, right? What's the history of how white people became white? These are important things. And I think when you begin to understand these stories and you do your own work, then you see how it all fits into a bigger picture. And when you look back, then you have a better sense of how to move forward. And so I think those are some easy steps. And I would also just recommend, look into, like, there's an organization called Faith in Action that's all around the country, organizing group. And so there's a lot of, there's other national organizations as well, but that's an umbrella organization where many faith-based organizers work under. Here in Harrisburg, if people are interested, connect with me. We have a group called Free Together, doing some connecting with a whole bunch of organizers and activists in our city as well.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Drew. Thanks, David. Thank you to our viewers. Everyone, stay safe. See you guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.